welcome back. So we haven't done one of these in a while. I think the last one was back at early September, and it's almost the end of the month, so I figured it would be about time to do another one of these. And today I figured we would also rank the Axe Cavalry. We are running a bit low on archetypes now because we've done a good amount of these, but I'm thinking about going into the 5 stars eventually because it could be worth covering them as well. However, those are probably going to be a lot more bloated, and there's probably going to be a lot more to discuss because chances are most of them are going to have PRFs worth talking about. But that's a subject for another time. For now, we're going to be looking at the readily available 3 and 4 star Axe Cavalry. That includes all the ones that you can get in the normal pool as well as through the Grail shop. Nothing that is seasonal locked unless, again, they are through the Grail shop. And I think we have about 11 to go over. So yeah, that's what we're going to do today. There really isn't much else to say in terms of introduction, so I may as well go into how I'm going to be ranking these units before we just get completely started with our first unit. Basically, I rank each of these units according to 2 ratings, their performance rating and their cost rating. The performance rating is complete subjectivity based on how I believe they hold up in the current meta, while the cost rating is just how easy it is to invest into a unit on a minimalistic level. So if you're looking to use them on budget, that's really what the cost rating is going to be about, but if you're looking just to max merge them and build them up, and you have all the readily available fodder, then I really wouldn't worry about this rating too much. But in terms of max performance, that's what the performance rating is going to be about. So that's all it really boils down to. And really, there isn't much else to say on the matter, so we may as well just get started with our first Axe Cavalry unit, Frederick. I think in terms of stat lines, Frederick didn't get the worst one, even though he does have limited BST because he is a cavalry unit. The fact that he still has 35 base attack with 36 defense isn't actually all that bad, especially for the role he finds himself in. However, his weapon in question isn't exactly the best nowadays. It wasn't exactly like the best refine even when it came out, but considering that it was effectively just a big might hammer, which also grants death blow, it wasn't exactly the worst, but I find nowadays that it's just almost completely unusable in the player phase, and that may seem a bit harsh, or maybe not depending on your definition of harsh, because it is a 2018 refine. Even with that being the case, I find that because a lot of armors definitely prioritize their enemy phase nowadays, there are the rare armors that definitely go into the player phase, but a majority of them definitely specialize in the enemy phase. Having a player phase weapon with armor effectiveness, at least akin to this one, without any sort of other effect that allows them to function in the player phase, isn't exactly going to be doing them a lot of favors. Then on top of the fact that we also just have stuff like Hardy Fighter, it makes it really difficult for units like Frederick to just get damage out in general. And even though he still has 35 attack at base, which is really good, I find that it's just not going to be doing all too much in general, and that rather than running something for the player phase, at least with this weapon, you're better off prioritizing the enemy phase. However, even on budget, I find that his best go-to weapon isn't even his PRF, but rather an inheritable. In terms of budget, I find that you're actually better off just giving him Seahorse Axe, because it does grant him a guaranteed follow-up attack, which is really strong in general. So if you wanted to use him right out of the gate, you can actually use it quite well because Seahorse Axe is readily available in the Grail shop, which is really convenient. And you can always just give him attack defense cash from any readily available cav that you can also get in the Grail shop. It's pretty cheap, all things considered. You could also give him attack smoke so that way he could eat hits in the enemy phase after initiating combat. You could always just keep Luna because there's a good chance that the foe is going to be able to double him anyway, but he will be able to get 2 attacks out as long as he can meet his condition. But that's also why we have Hit and Run, because if he were to extend all his movement and then the enemy phase were to commence, then he wouldn't get the guaranteed follow-up because he has to be within 2 spaces of an ally if he has to attack in the enemy phase to get the guaranteed follow-up. So with Hit and Run, he can at least move back 1 space and then be in range of an ally while not necessarily putting them in range of a foe, which is really convenient. And in terms of a max investment build, I still think you're better off keeping Seahorse Axe because it is a really good inheritable. Because just having a guaranteed follow-up is always really convenient. And you don't necessarily have to speed stack them. You could still do that if you really wanted to. But I find that because you don't necessarily have to invest into a speed in this regard, you can actually continue to stack up his attack and defense and make him a pretty good wall and hard-hitting unit. And with Flow Guard, he'll still be able to double through any sort of follow-up prevention unless the foe has no follow-up and a good amount of speed. But with the likes of Flow Guard, Clash, Attack Smoke 4, and Heavy Blade, he can actually also function as a Gale Force unit, which functions really, really well, not only with Attack Defense Clash, but also Seahorse Axe, because if he were able to run away, he could at least get back to an ally, and then still meet the conditions of Clash and Seahorse Axe, especially if the foe moves more than one space, which is really, really nice. And while his PRF never really held up, and he is a bit more generic nowadays, I find that because he has access to the likes of Seahorse Axe, it is a lot better than other sort of generics that you would find in the Lance Cavalry pool. And that isn't to say Lance Cavalry don't have options, but I find that Seahorse Axe in particular is a really, really good weapon, especially in terms of just competition for generics. It does allow them to stand out a lot more in that regard. Next we have Gunter, who basically has a PRF Love Candelabra with a chill attack defense weapon. But rather than targeting the foe that has the highest attack defense total, it just targets the slowest unit on the enemy team. Which isn't too bad, all things considered, because a lot of the times foes with low speed tend to prioritize their mixed bulk anyway, so it's not bad in that regard. In terms of just overall stat line, it's pretty much just Frederick's with less stats, because intelligence systems thought that let's just give less stats to the veteran types, which is also known as veteran BST. I only think him and Jagan are the only ones that suffer from this, but correct me if I'm wrong. In any case, his weapon is not really the worst. It is worth noting that his attack defense boost that he grants during combat only works for infantry and cavalry, so if you are looking to just use him in general for support, you may want to give him Love Candelabra instead, because even though you are losing out on the likes of the chill attack and defense, if you were to use this on a mixed team, then it wouldn't work for some allies, but if you're just using an infantry and cavalry team, then it's not necessarily the worst, because at the end of the day, it's still an attack defense boost with chill attack defense, which, again, isn't really bad whatsoever. And to be honest, even though he does have a similar stat line akin to Frederick, I think you're better off just keeping him as support, not only just for the uniqueness of it, but also because Frederick just simply does what he could be doing in combat but better. Which is why I'm not really going to be recommending any sort of combat builds, but rather just focusing on supportive capabilities. So you can keep his PRF and Veteran Axe, and again, it's not necessarily the worst, but Love Candelabra does put a dent into it because it does work with every single ally. But again, you are losing out on the chill effect. So whatever you really find more valuable, you may as well just use. But even then, in Veteran Axe, if you have it, not really the worst, but you may not want to waste 2 on it regardless. But even then, I think you're better off just keeping an HP boon and stacking up HP skills and drives, so that way he can at least take advantage of some stats for supportive capabilities. And at +1, he can still get 55 HP with an HP boon, of course, as well as HP +5. You could then give him Panic Ploy and Drive Attack and then a Link, so that way he's just providing a pretty good stat swing. Panic Ploy may not always do much, because it is a cardinal direction skill, but in terms of just C support skills, you could also swap it out with the likes of Drive Attack. But the only reason I did give him Panic Ploy here is because otherwise his A-Slot would pretty much go to waste, but it really doesn't matter in that regard. However, in terms of a high investment build, you could always just give him even Pulse Tie with Joint Drive Attack and another Drive Attack, and forego Panic Ploy, but you're still stacking HP so that way you could get even Pulse Tie off, which isn't the worst at all. You could always also just keep Drive Attack 2 for a C-Slot, but Joint Drive Attack does grant 1 more point of attack, which is why it's up here. And then with a Rally Plus, he could just continue to boost stats in general, which is really, really convenient. And again, in terms of just stat line, he is pretty much akin to Frederick, albeit a bit weaker, but not too weaker to the point where I would rank him a bit lower. And Seahorse Axe definitely does a lot of the heavy lifting, and because of that, he isn't exactly the worst in terms of combat, but obviously there's just going to be a lot of better units. Next we have Pluggy and Chris, who is one of the few generic Axe Cavs that we have in the game. For a while we didn't actually have a lot of Cavalry Axes readily available, or even in the 5-star pool if I remember correctly, but eventually they just started pumping them out like generics, especially through the Tempest Trials. But regardless, Pluggy and Chris doesn't really have a PRF to call his own, but he does have a relatively good offensive stat line of 37 attack and speed. And he also comes with Pluggy and Axe, which I think everyone has a good idea of how it works. But basically, it's just a massive stat swing to attack and defense based on the current penalties on the foe. And you do have to be solo for this weapon to work, so that can take away some niches in terms of just overall melee specialists, but not necessarily for Pluggy and Chris. I'm talking about if you were to use this weapon. But even then, it can still provide a really solid chunk of stats, because it basically just doubles whatever penalty is on the foe, and then you add 5, which is pretty good. In terms of just ready out of the gate builds, you can actually just keep his Pluggy and Axe because it isn't exactly the worst by any means. And because it can provide a massive stat swing, you can actually just continue to stack up his attack and defense as much as possible while prioritizing a bit of his speed so that way he can at least double, because the weapon doesn't grant any sort of combat effect outside of stats. And then with the likes of Renewal, Rouse Attack Defense, and Chill Attack Defense too, you can make his weapon a lot more self-sufficient. And in terms of just enemy phase B slots, there really aren't that many. You could always give him Quick Riposte, but I find that you may not want to unless you want to at least counter those impact skills, which can occur even if he has a good amount of speed. Because he doesn't have any sort of way of securing his own double, it can prove fatal if he doesn't have the ability to double. But in any case, you could also just make him into a really solid offensive unit with the likes of Surge Sparrow, Trace, and Menace. Menace won't work all too well against units that can protect the targeted foe, and that usually comes in the form of near save. But if you were to run any sort of sabotage support instead, you could also replace his C slot for something else, and then you can still get the plug-in effect going, which is really, really convenient. Unless they have some sort of penalty neutralization, but that's a whole different issue on its own. And then with Surge Sparrow and Heavy Blade and Near Trace, he can actually heal back up whatever damage he takes in the player phase and then run away, which will actually allow him to survive a lot more, which is really convenient. And I find that because his offensive prowess is a lot better than the likes of Frederick and Gunter, I'm willing to give him 0.5 more in terms of performance. And he can still do the same thing as Frederick and Gunter with the likes of Seahorse Axe. And he does have a bit more flexibility in his B slot because of his extra speed. And because of that, I do think he is worth rating a bit above. Next, we have Lex, who is one of the few demote dual phase brave units in the game. And it's a really, really strong effect. Even though it is relatively basic in what it does, he does end up putting out a lot of damage in general because he's able to attack twice regardless of the foe's skills and regardless of anything, because it is dual phase brave. He does also get a res penalty from his weapon, but he does grant defense in turn. And the thing is that his res was never really great to begin with, so any extra defense could actually be really, really beneficial, especially if you want to use him for frontliner purposes in 8th or 8's defense. But even with that being the case, his res was never really that great anyway, so it's not really worth worrying about all too much. He also has a really solid attack stat of 36, and while the weapon is only 11 light, it can actually hurt quite a bit, especially if you were to pair him up with the right support. In terms of a budget set, there really isn't much in terms of B slots, unfortunately, because he already has everything he needs in his weapon. So in that regard, you could always just make him into a melee specialist, stack up attack and defense form on both his A slot and Sacred Seal, dual close so he can neutralize any of the foe's bonuses, and then attack smoke so he could just tank more, which isn't bad whatsoever. But I find that his best set is easily going to come from a distant counter advantage set because of the dual phase brave effect. And while this would definitely be prioritizing his enemy phase prowess, he can actually do quite a lot of work because of it. You will want to run support, whether that's Winter Bernadetta or Brave Lysithea, so that way he can instant charge advantage, because if you are trying to set it up on the foe, while you can potentially do that, it's a lot more risky in that regard because there's a good chance that the foe can either just have a brave attack or they could just one-shot him through his res. And even though he also has good HP, I also find that setting up via Ardent Sacrifice is also going to be a lot better in terms of damage output because he can at least secure Distance Storm additional damage. And then with the likes of Joint Drive Attack and Brazen Attack Defense, he could just hit really, really hard in general. And in my opinion, if you are looking for a really solid Axe Cavalry unit, Lex is probably one of the best investments you could go for at the moment. There is another one I'm going to mention, but that's not going to be till way later. But in terms of just readily available normal pool Axe Cavs, he's easily one of the best, if not the best ones we have currently. Next, we have Marth, who is also relatively generic because he also lacks a PRF, and in terms of just overall offensive stat line, it's not exactly the best. It wasn't actually too bad way back when we didn't really have any Axe Cavs, and everyone pretty much touted that Spring Alphonse was like the de facto Axe Cavalry unit of all time. So when we got Marth, it actually wasn't that bad because he had a really good speed stat, and his attack stat wasn't even that bad for its time. It's not exactly the best now, but it's not exactly horrible nowadays. He came with Ardent Service, which is basically a joint hone attack, and it's fine. It's not really the best, it's not really the worst, but in terms of just using it for combat, I really wouldn't recommend it. Which is why if you did have to use them on budget, honestly in terms of just budget skills, there really aren't that many cavalry units can really take advantage of. So in terms of just using them for right out of the gate purposes, honestly a Fury Desperation set probably isn't the worst, you're at least stacking up his attack and speed, and that way he can at least get 2 attacks out more consistently before the foe can counterattack. And with Springy Axe, which you could get from a Spring Sally, he can actually just secure his own doubles, which is really convenient because it does have penalty neutralization in it. However, in terms of a max investment build, honestly, I think Seahorse Axe might be the better call here. It may seem redundant to run Seahorse Axe with a speedy unit, but you do have to keep in mind that if a unit does have any sort of wary or impact effect, and the unit does have a guaranteed follow-up, then it does become a speed check, in which case Marth can win out because his speed stat is actually pretty good. So with the likes of Surge Sparrow, Solo, Trace, and Speed Smoke, he can actually also set up for the enemy phase by getting damage reduction from his C slot, and then run away so that way he can at least get back in range of allies so he can meet his Seahorse Axe conditions. However, I find that at least comparatively to Pluggy and Chris, and other similar units that have way better attack stats, I find that he's just a bit worse, but even then, he still has access to all the flowers, so the differences aren't going to be too grand, but in terms of just overall recommendation and performance, I find that Pluggy and Chris is just going to be a better pick. Next, we have Spring Sally, who also is generic. As I mentioned before, most of the Axe Cavs that we do have are generic, as they were pumping out a lot of these back in maybe like 2020, 2021, because we really didn't have any of them, and it wasn't really a saturated archetype, and as such, they gave us a bunch of inheritable weapons, mostly axes through Tempest Trials on Axe Cavalry units, and it was really rare that we got anything but an Axe Cavalry. He also has a really solid offensive stat line of 37-36 attack and speed. His defensive stats aren't exactly the greatest, but he does actually have a decent res stat, which can actually come into play in some regard, which I'll go into in a second. But he also has Springy Axe, which I did mention previously. It has penalty neutralization to attack and speed, but also grants attack and speed +5 if the foe's HP is above 75% at the start of combat. In terms of just overall budget purposes, honestly, you could always just make him into a big stat ball with the likes of just stacking up solos and a Link. He already comes with Rouse Attack Res, so giving him Speed Defense Link from a Norn isn't exactly the worst option. And then grabbing Speed Res Solo from an Urk, and then running Attack Defense Solo in your Seal, you can actually just bolster all his stats by 12 points respectively, which isn't too bad whatsoever. However, in terms of really expensive premium builds, honestly, I think a Windsweep build could really work here. As I mentioned, Seahorse Axe does grant a guaranteed follow-up, and if the foe has any sort of wary or impact effect, or any sort of follow-up prevention, then it will become a speed check. So with the likes of Seahorse Axe and Windsweep, you are effectively taking the ability to double consistently, but if you can make the speed check, then you can still double through it, and you would be able to prevent most counterattacks, which is really convenient. However, the only thing you would be missing out on is Dragon matchups, which is why I gave him Rouse Attack Res 4 and Attack Res Solo, so that way he could at least take damage from a Dragon if he needs to. And he can always heal it back up with Noontime, which is really convenient. And akin to the likes of Pluggy and Chris and all the other similar units with a relatively decent offensive stat line, he's also going to be getting a 6 out of 10 from me. I find that the inheritables that we have for axes are a bit stronger than the lances, so if they do seem a bit higher, that's probably why. Next we have Somerset, and it's again treading old ground for the most part. He does have a really good offensive stat line, a 40 attack, which is really high, and a 38 speed, which is really good. But he also comes with Seahorse Axe, which basically saved a lot of axe units in general, because now they could just double without any sort of speed stat or quick riposte, and they can function in both phases with this, which is really nice. However, at the end of the day, he is still generic, but he does have a good defense set of 31, which is why he's going to have a similar build, but you'll see why I'm going with this logic in a second. For the most part, you can pretty much just run the same thing you would run on budget, but on premium. You can keep his innate speed defense catch, give him Water Sweep instead of Wind Sweep, Attack Smoke, and then Attack Speed Solo with Noontime so he could just keep his sustainability. And the same thing on premium, but you're just upgrading the catch, and rather than giving him Attack Smoke, you could actually just give him Speed Smoke 4, so he can get damage reduction properties in the enemy phase once he has to take a hit, or if he has to take a hit. The only thing he will be losing out on is the ability to run back to an ally, which can suck if he has to take a hit in the enemy phase and he isn't near them, or you can't approach him. I don't want to spell doom and gloom for it for the most part because it's not really the biggest problem, but it is worth considering nonetheless. And in regards to Water Sweep over Wind Sweep, I find that he could just take a hit physically if he needs to, and because his res stat isn't exactly the highest, and because there's only one archetype that can target his res at one range, preventing any sort of attack from those foes is going to be beneficial for him in the long term for his survivability. And again, he's still rather generic, but I find that he's probably one of the best Axe Cav generics that we have in the game because his offensive stat line on top of his defense stat is really, really solid. Next, we have Titania, who got really messed up at the beginning of the game and didn't really get any better throughout it, unfortunately. She does have access to a lot of good inheritables, thankfully, so if you did want to use her in combat, you can. But 28 base attack isn't exactly great, even though she does have 34 speed, which is pretty good, and 30 res, which can still be worked out. And I'm going to be using that stat for the builds in a second. Regardless, her PRF is just a triangle adept weapon that grants res tactic, and it's not the worst by any means, but I find that if you're looking for a good buff bot, you may as well just use Fa, because she can grant +5 to everything to any ally without any sort of team composition limitations, as long as she's within 2 spaces of an ally, which is really, really convenient. So if you're looking for a good buff bot, I find that Fa is just a lot better. If you want to use Titania, you can, and there's a lot of stuff you can do on budget because we do have access to a majority of the tactics in the 3 and 4 star pool, as well as sabotage attack through the Grail shop, and for the most part, that's all you really need to run on her. I find that her combat isn't exactly the greatest anyway, but again, you can still make do with it because we do have a lot of good inheritables to work with. Still, in terms of budget, you can just make her into a support unit, run triple tactic with the likes of attack tactic and defense tactic, and then give her a sabotage while stacking up her res with the likes of Fort Res, so that way she could at least provide even more stat swings. And then on premium, it's basically just an upgrade. The special doesn't really matter regardless of the build, but you could also give her rally up speed, so that way she could buff every single stat for 6 points to all allies within 2 spaces, which is really convenient. But again, it's not really going to be all too different from what you were doing on budget. It's just a lot more premium heavy. And to be honest, you could probably get away with the likes of just a +0 or even a +1. As long as you are able to stack up her res to a considerable degree, you can actually make her into a pretty okay support unit. And even though she still has access to the likes of Seahorse Axe and all the like, I find that her performance just isn't really that great in terms of combat or support. Because again, we do have the likes of Fa, who is just a better buff bot in general. And while she can replicate a lot of stuff with the likes of Seahorse Axe, her attack stat at 28 just isn't really good. So even though I did rank Marth a bit lower because of his 31 attack, I'm going to rank Titania a bit lower because of her 28 attack. Next we have Violence, who's also another generic, but he also has a lot of attack. 41 base attack is really, really good with 36 defense, and 30 speed isn't even bad whatsoever. You could stack that up if you really wanted to. And outside of that, he just has a lot of HP and no res, which honestly kind of works in his favor. I did give a similar build to the likes of Seth, and while he does have a lot more speed to work with, you can actually do a similar thing here, which I'll go into in a second, but he comes with Unbound Axe, which is basically a solo condition that inflicts -5 attack and defense on the foe and the lull effect to attack and defense, which isn't bad whatsoever. However, because he is relatively generic, you can still do the same thing as you would with pretty much all the other cabs, but I do want to at least try and incorporate more build ideas instead of just heavily relying on 1 or 2 weapons, because I could just keep saying, oh yeah, just use Seahorse Axe with XYZ because yada yada yada. But if you don't want to do that, then there are alternatives, and I do at least want to provide those. But in any case, you can continue to stack up his attack and defense as much as possible, make him into another melee specialist. With the likes of Unbound Axe and Quick Riposte, he can at least get a bonfire off really, really easily and hit really, really hard in general. 60 attack with Unbound Axe at +1 is really, really, really good. And as I mentioned before, you can actually take advantage of his speed stat. You are basically going to be running a similar set to the likes of Somerset, but I find that even though Violent doesn't have as much speed, he may end up performing a bit better, mainly because of the fact that he does have a good defense stat. And with the likes of Seahorse Axe and Water Sweep, he still has to make a speed check to secure his own double, and while Seth will be able to do it a lot better, stacking speed really isn't that difficult in general, which is why I do think Violent can make for a really good user of this. And while Violent would have to stack up his speed a bit more because he doesn't have as much as Seth, I find that their performances are going to be relatively similar for the most part, which is why I'm going to give Violent a 6 out of 10. And because he doesn't cost Grails, honestly, I would recommend just building him over Seth. Next we have Wallheart, who I don't necessarily want to call underrated because a lot of people have built him and definitely have hyped him up, but I also don't think I've given him at least any proper credit. I may not have said it in the past, but I do think that the weapon is really, really good, but I think the problem mainly stems from the meta that we're currently in. But in recent times, I think it's aged a lot better, and I'll go into that in a second. For now, let's talk about Wolfbark. It grants +6 to everything visibly if he's within 4 spaces of a foe, which isn't going to be too hard unless the foe is a ranged cav, because they could just extend their range way too much and then just attack, and that would kind of suck. But in terms of just visibly buffing him, it's not too bad whatsoever. He also grants Spectrum 4 to himself during combat, which is really convenient for just bolstering his overall stat line. And then he also inflicts -7 attack and defense on foes within 4 spaces, as well as the flash effect. And this is not just one foe. If any foe is within 4 spaces of him, they all get affected, which is really, really solid. And then at the start of combat, if the foe's HP is above 75%, he inflicts -5 attack and defense on the foe during combat. So essentially, it's a lot of stats to work with, albeit a lot of them are visible, so it is a bit more deceptive on that front. But even then, he could still buff himself really, really easily and inflict flash, which is really, really convenient. And in terms of his stats, he has 37 attack, which is really, really solid, 36 defense, which is really good, and he also has 27 speed, which you can make work. I don't think it's going to be an issue on that front. In any case, going back to Wolfborg for a second, I find that when it came out, a lot of the issues stem from the fact that near saves were a thing, and they are still a thing, to be fair. And because near saves were a lot more common back when this came out, he wasn't really able to take advantage of the flash effect as much as he probably would have wanted to, because you could easily just position a near save and a far save behind a unit, and they could still attack Wallheart at the end of the day because the flash effect wouldn't hit them. However, in recent times, because of the likes of Summoner Duels and Chaos Season, especially the latter, you can only choose one unit for savior purposes. And more often than not, people are going to be choosing far save because ranged threats tend to be a lot more prevalent, which is why in that regard, Wallheart is going to be a lot better, because he can still flash a unit, and he can still be protected by the flash status, because more often than not, people aren't going to be running near save. In terms of budget sets, honestly, I don't think he's really worth using at +0 or +1. If you are going to use Wallheart, I find that your best option is to simply just wait till you can invest into him at a maximum level, because that's when he's really going to get really, really good. However, you can actually use him supportively on budget, which may seem really dumb, but it's also akin to the likes of Gunter in that regard. Because he can inflict flash on foes within 4 spaces, you could potentially try and bait out a foe, and then just take advantage of the flash status only. In terms of just overall usage, I find that if you really are going to use him, his best bet is definitely going to be on premium, where you could continue to stack up his offenses as much as possible, give him attack smoke 4, so that way he can at the very least prevent any sort of doubles in general, unless the foe has any sort of no follow-up effect. But even then, you can still continue to stack up his attack and speed as much as possible, and combined with the likes of Wolfborg, he'll actually be able to do quite a lot of work. And to be honest, if Lex didn't exist, I think Wallheart would be the only Axe Cav I would ever recommend, at least currently, for 3 and 4 star purposes. However, because he is locked behind grails, there is a bit more of an opportunity cost. But even then, in terms of just general flexibility, they both do different things. However, I am willing to give Wallheart the edge here, because I do find that his combative purposes is just a bit better. But even then, dual phase Brave versus Flash, you really can't go wrong with either. It's just honestly going to come down to preference. But I do think in terms of just available Axe Cavalry units that we have in the game right now, Wallheart's definitely going to be the best one so far. And then finally, we have Grimzilla, who is also another generic, akin to the likes of Frederick, Gunter, all that jazz, but he has a bit of a better stat line with 37 attack and 39 defense. His res isn't exactly the highest either, and you could potentially try to make the speed work, but your best bet's really just going to be able to stack attack and defense as much as possible, akin to the other two. And then he also comes with Love Candelabra, which I did go over a bit briefly at the beginning when I was talking about Gunter, but it is basically just his refine effect that works on every single ally. And honestly, it's not even that bad of a weapon for supportive purposes. Obviously, we do have a lot more options when it comes to combat weapons, so I really wouldn't recommend this weapon unless it were budget. Even that, it's still not the worst inheritable. I wouldn't honestly make him into a support unit, because at the end of the day, it is basically just drive, attack, and defense. And in terms of just supportive capabilities, it would basically be treading old ground. So rather than doing that, you can actually just attempt to make him into an enemy phase cav with the likes of double attack defense 4, quick riposte, and browse attack defense, and continue to stack up his attack defense as much as possible, and then make him a big defense wall. And to be honest, you're better off just using Seahorse Axe, but if you just want to use Love Candelabra, it's not really going to be that bad. The only thing you are just losing out on is the guaranteed follow-up, which could be used instead of quick riposte, but given that Cavs don't really have a lot of B-slot options, especially on budget, It's not really the worst trade-off, especially if you are looking to save feathers and grails. However, in terms of premium sets, I find that Seahorse Axe is still going to be the go-to option, but you can continue to stack up attack and defense as much as possible with the likes of Sturdy Surge, Low Attack Defense, and Attack Spoke 4, and then with Heavy Blade, he can trigger a bonfire in every second hit if the foe is able to counterattack and there aren't any guard effects present, and with that, at the very least, he will be able to hit quite hard in general, and heal back whatever he takes, if he takes any damage at all. He will probably still take damage from the occasional dragon, so Sturdy Surge is pretty helpful in that regard. However, at the end of the day, he's still relatively generic, and he does follow in suit with the likes of Frederick and Gunter, so I don't really think a higher rating is going to be warranted. But even then, we have Seahorse Axe, and that does carry a lot of weight in terms of just overall generic usage. And who knows, maybe the next time we get an Arcane Axe, he may end up being one of the best axe cavs in the game. But it's really, really hard to say because we really have no idea what the future holds. But regardless, I find that he's definitely relatively similar to the likes of those two in terms of performance. But he may be one of the best ones because his stat line is a bit more modern and he has a lot more stats to work with. But in any case, these were all the readily available axe calves. This was a bit more fun to do, and I know I haven't done one of these in a while. I've been meaning to get around to it, but circumstances and all sorts of stuff happened, so I apologize on that front. But yeah, we're back with this, and I'm hoping to continue this trend going forward. So if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.